Right, everyone should be able to
Okay.
see now. Do you want me to run back to the start?
Yes, please. Apologies, everybody. It seems that we've run the broadcast without any sound, which isn't great. So, Lauren, do you want to start again?
Yeah, so hopefully everybody can hear us now. So good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar looking at African swine fever. Today we're going to be looking at how ASF began, signs and symptoms, what to do if you suspect a case, and what you can be doing now to help protect your business. So we're joined today by Mandy Nevel, Head of Animal Health and Welfare at AHDB, and Katie Jarvis, Senior Policy Advisor at National Pig Association. Please feel free to type any questions you may have as we go along in the question box. That can be located in the top right hand side of your screens, and we'll have a chance to discuss these questions with the panel at the end. So I shall hand back to Mandy, and hopefully you will be able to hear her this time.
Thanks very much. I have had messages to say that people can hear and see us, so apologies for the technical glitches, everybody, and good afternoon and thank you. I'm going to talk about why we should worry about ASF and just looking at what we can do to help prepare should the worst happen. Next slide, please. Looking back to 2007 when ASF came in from East Africa, most likely on a container ship that came into the west coast of Georgia into a port called Poti, and right next to that port was a waste disposal place, a landfill site, which pigs were known to actively scavenge on. And ASF is widespread in East Africa, in Mozambique and Tanzania, where the ship came from, and most likely carried infected pork product that pigs in Georgia then ate and succumbed to the disease. And since 2007, it has been spreading throughout Europe. So if we look at 2014, you'll see that it has spread through places in Russia, and the blue spots indicate the wild boar and the red spots the domesticated pigs. You'll notice throughout this that Belarus remains clear because they don't report any ASF to WOA, which is the Animal Health Office. But by 2014, already some cases in Lithuania and starting to move into the Baltic states. And you'll see that spreading in 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, and gradually spreading. We've got a case in the Czech Republic, going down into Hungary, Romania, and then 2018, 2019, quite large spreads. We've got a jump across into Belgium, and that's a big jump. And that jump indicates that it's not local spread from pig to pig. What that is probably humans taking infected pork meat and it getting into a local population there of wild boar in Belgium in 2019. And then if we go on to 2020, you'll see it's getting onto the German border, 2021, 2022, moving westwards, 23, 24. And if we think about where we were 3 years ago, just 3 years ago, you can see that there's been quite a large spread westwards towards the UK coast. So the latest cases, which are circled in yellow, so excluding that Belgian case and the cases that we have in Sardinia, you'll see it's almost like a weather front coming towards the UK. And my fear is that it is approaching our shoreline. So on the next slide, you'll see just an arrow, and then that's why I think we need to be worried, because it is moving, and it is moving like a weather front westwards. When we think about ASF, we think of it largely as not largely, but quite often it affects the wild boar. And when we look at the density of wild boar across Europe on the next slide, you'll see that most of the wild boar are actually in Germany and France, and those are not areas that have been badly affected by ASF. But when it gets into those populations, then it's going to be extremely difficult to control. So I think as it spreads further west, the risk exponentially increases for us. Next slide, please. Just talking about ASF, the disease, a reminder what to look out for, what to do if you suspect a case, and then I'll just talk about a couple of key messages. Next slide. The disease is a notifiable disease, which means its control is governed by legislation, and DEFRA will have responsibility for that control. Clinically, it's indistinguishable from classical swine fever. So we have classical swine fever and African swine fever. And they are fevers because they cause really high temperatures. But in addition to that, they'll cause bleeding and mortality of the animals, and they will also cause abortions. And I think a really important point to note is that particularly in the early stages of disease, you may not get the mass mortality that people generally associate with notifiable diseases. It may just be one dead pig, and that's particularly likely in wild boar populations or on small scale farms. Good biosecurity, however, will keep it off your farm, and this is very different to a number of other diseases like foot and mouth, where you have to have exceptionally tight biosecurity to keep it off, and even then you might get wind spread. But with ASF, good biosecurity will keep it off your farm, and we have seen that in areas where there's a lot of ASF, and some farms have actually managed to keep it out of their pigs, and that's all through good biosecurity. So I think one of the key messages today is that good biosecurity does actually work, and it is worth paying attention to. Next slide, please. So these are some photos from a colleague of mine, John Carr. So I'd like to thank John for these photos. They're not taken in the UK, but you'll see the pig in the middle with very reddened skin, has a very high temperature, and interestingly the pen mates in the same pen not showing any of the clinical signs that pig is, but that pig is clearly very poorly. Next slide. And again, another very sick pig that's obviously been down quite a long time. It's very dirty, very red, and compared to its pen mate, a very different scenario. Next slide, please. So the animals will be generally very reddened, very dark in colour because they've got very high temperatures. They're bleeding internally and externally. They'll be very sick. There won't be any getting away from a sick pig, but it may not be, a widespread thing with lots and lots of pigs being very sick. Next slide, please. You'll see a very distressed animal, swollen eyelids, bleeding from its nose, bleeding from its ears, and obviously that pig is suffering very badly. Next slide, please. But you won't just get the bleeding, you may get abortions, and you can get abortion storms with the swine fevers. So again, if you see that, just alarm bells should start ringing. Next slide, please. When we open up these pigs on post-mortem, we can see that there'll be abnormal hemorrhages in organs in the internal cavities of the pig. So this is the stomach, and you can see the little red blood splashes. Those are little hemorrhages, little bleeding on the surface of the stomach. Next slide, please. And on the kidney, you can see the speckled surface of this. Those are all little blood spots or hemorrhages on the kidney, which is completely abnormal. And anytime you see this, when you open up a pig, alarm bells again will start to ring. And similarly on the next slide, you'll see that the spleen is also affected, and that has what we call infarcts as well as hemorrhages, and that makes it quite knobbly and areas of kind of darkened blood clots really, but also areas where the blood can't then get to. So really abnormal spleen. And again, if you opened up a pig and saw that, you would start to have alarm bells ringing in your head. Next slide, please. So just as a kind of a recap, biosecurity does work. It may just be one dead pig or one affected pig, particularly in the early stages of the disease. And just because you haven't got mass mortality doesn't mean to say it can't be African swine fever. That's particularly true in wild boar or equally on small scale producing units. And and you may not have a striking outbreak, which I think most people, when they think about notifiable diseases, think you're going to have a really striking outbreak right from the outset, and that's not true. Next slide, please. So if you do actually suspect a case of African swine fever or any notifiable disease, it's actually a legal requirement to notify the relevant authority, and they're different in England, Wales and Scotland. But if you do suspect it, it's not confirmation of disease, it's if you suspect it, you should report it immediately, and failure to do so is a criminal offence. I think in reality, a lot of people would probably phone their vet, but if in any doubt, you must report that to DEFRA and take advice from them. So I'm going to just go through what would actually happen if there was a case or a suspect case. The key messages really are to know what to look for and make sure that everybody who looks after pigs on your units, that they know what the clinical signs are and what to do if you suspect it. Maintain or improve your defence barriers and encourage all staff to do the same all of the time. Biosecurity does work, and it is something that you can do to protect your own farm. And it's really important that we can't focus on a lot of the things around the legislation and whatnot, but what we can do is we can focus on what we can do to keep off our own farms, and also being prepared just in case the worst does happen. The risk is increasing, and I think it's really important that people are prepared in peacetime to put in place plans and things that they can do should the worst happen. So next slide, please. Yeah, so know what to do and be prepared. So keeping all notifiable diseases out remains key for the whole of the pig sector. Anytime we get these notifiable diseases, our export market stops, and that will have a huge impact on everybody that produces pigs. And all these notifiable diseases are controlled by DEFRA. The only slight difference here is that AHDB has a legal responsibility to look at what happens in the case of porcine epidemic diarrhea virus. Next slide, please. So just an anomaly there. So when a notifiable disease is suspected, a call will be made to DEFRA Rural Services or the appropriate one in Scotland or Wales, and restrictions will be implemented over the phone. APHA vets will arrive to investigate and or take samples. They may rule it out at that stage, but if it is a suspect case that they can't rule out just by looking, then they will take samples and they will provide written instructions on what restrictions are issued. Next slide, please. And there may or may not be a temporary control zone put in place around that initial farm. And restrictions will remain until investigation is over and the disease is ruled out. Next slide. The official confirmation of a case will come from the Chief Veterinary Officer, and we will immediately lose our disease-free status. There will need to be actions on the infected premises to reduce the risk of spread, which is likely to be a full cull, and then cleansing and disinfection on that infected premises. There'll be a tracings exercise which will look at movement on and off the farm for the last 21 days. And so having records available readily will be really helpful. And then there will be further restrictions for in-contact premises and control zones and culling, etc. And DEFRA will be in control and will tell producers what they need to do, what zones they're in. But other actions that could spread the disease will be banned, so things like shows and exports. Next slide, please. So at the centre of this diagram, we have the infected premise, and then immediately around that, once that's confirmed, there will be a protection zone, which is currently 3 kilometres, and then a surveillance zone of 10 kilometres. And there's different legislation to cover what restrictions are in place for the infected premise, the protection zone, and the surveillance zone. And also there's legislation to cover how long those stay in place for. Next slide, please. What that looks like on a map is, as you can see on the left, this is a very simple protection zone in the paler blue, and then the surveillance zone in the larger, darker circle, which is a 10 kilometre. And it is just put on the website like that. and any farm that is in either the protection or the surveillance zone will have to comply with the legislation. And I think it's really important to note that if we do have an outbreak and it affects more than one unit, those control zones may come on at different times. There may be different lags, intervals between them. The middle diagram is taken from avian influenza, and you can see in the top right there are 3 different surveillance zones there, and some farms will have been unlucky enough to be in each of those 3 different surveillance zones, possibly at different times. They could be a number of weeks apart, so you might actually, if you're unlucky and there's local spread to where you are, you might be in different surveillance zones or protection zones for a prolonged period of time. And the diagram on the right is an actual zone that was taken from the 2007 FMD outbreak. So they're not always totally circular, but will be kind of merged to make it more logical for those control zones. Next slide, please. As I said, the legislation that governs what you can do depending on which area you're in. So if you're in a suspect, on a contact farm, or on an infected premise, the legislation states that there will be restriction on movement and vehicles and people, and a person must not enter or leave the premises or move any vehicle to or from the premise, except under the authority of a licence granted by a veterinary inspector. Now, those licences aren't going to be issued within hours of a case, not even days. And so it's really important that provision is made on your farm that should you have an outbreak, that your farm and the people and the vehicles coming and going can operate. And I think this is really important where you have a family that live on the farm. And there's a whole host of restrictions. I can't go into that today because we don't have time, but this is number 7 of that. So there are a whole lot of restrictions, and farms in that restriction will be legally obliged to comply with these. Next slide, please. Similarly, if you're in a protection zone, which is the 3-kilometre zone, again, there are restrictions on the movement of animals and people, and what you can and what you can't do, and what you need a licence for. And I think it's worth noting that licences don't get issued necessarily immediately. In fact, rarely would they be issued immediately, and they may take a number of days to get. And certainly when the disease first comes into the country, I don't think any licence would be issued until DEFRA have got a good understanding of what the disease situation looks like. So already you can see that we're going to be under restrictions if you're in a protection zone or a surveillance zone for a number of days, if not weeks, right from the outset. Next slide, please. And in a surveillance zone, the restrictions might be less, but nevertheless, they are still there. And again, licenses and restrictions needed for any movement of animals to abattoirs or to premises, or even restrictions on slurry and germ products, so any semen or anything like that. So these will cause a lot of inconvenience to the majority of farms that are either in any of these zones. So knowing what they mean and preparing for the worst will pay dividends should the worst happen. Next slide, please. So the number of days that pigs and people can't move off a premise. So the top left one is the protection zone, and the right one is the surveillance zone. So not a lot of difference, but it does depend on where you are in proximity to the infected premise, but also whether there's more than one infected premise. So if there are multiple, not obviously, but if there are more than one infected premise, the restrictions last for longer. Next slide, please. And just a recap that although it says 40 days there, the restrictions may expand or duplicate, and you might think that you're just about to come out of a restriction zone for another case to pop up, and that restriction zone can be reenacted. So you might end up in kind of consecutive restriction zones. And I think that's just worth bearing in mind when you're trying to do some contingency planning. Next slide, please. So I think one of the things that farms can do to help in peacetime is just to think about the logistics on their own farm. And there are no hard and fast rules because most farms are unique. They're all different to each other. On this diagram, which is just an aerial shot, the stars indicate the entry and exit points where biosecurity measures would need to be put in place. And if you think about the logistics where you may have water on the left-hand side, but on the outdoor unit, you may not have shelter or electrics. And if you've got to have disinfection points there, that's a consideration to make. And then the red circles, I think, are just to try and consider the different types of enterprises that you may have on your own farms. So maybe you've got holiday cottages, maybe you've got a butcher's shop or a farm shop, maybe you rent out an industrial unit to a completely different business. Maybe you've got your own home right in the centre of the farm, which if you did have a disease would be put under restriction and nobody able to move on or off. And that may be fine if you're the farmer, but if you've got children going to school or you've got maybe elderly parents and carers coming onto site on or off a couple of times a day, then thinking about how you would deal with that up front and having a plan in place can really stop a lot of the anxiety should the worst happen. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to hand over to Katie to talk a little bit more about the detail of contingency plans. Thanks, Katie.
Yeah, thanks, Mandy. So I'll just start here very briefly with a little bit of a summary on border controls, which is part of the reason why we're getting a bit more focused on ASF contingency planning and preparedness for both farm level and sort of government level and supply chain level, actually. So you'll all be probably familiar by now with some of these images and some of these stories that have been coming out of Dover Port Health Authority in particular. Over the last sort of few months, we've been banging the drum quite loudly with the farming press and with the pig press as well. And Dover Port Health Authority has been also really strongly trying to make the case against the proposed cuts in their budget. So this is illegal meat. This has all been taken from coaches, vans, cars. It's all been captured at the border in these sort of routine checks as vehicles move through the port in Dover itself, so having come over on the ferry already and landed in this country. We're now at the point where there's been, I think it's around 80 tons of illegal meat in total since September 2022. The vast majority of that is pig meat, and the vast majority of that has come from countries in the east of Europe where African swine fever is particularly prevalent. There have also been sheep carcasses found, and I think some cattle poultry as well. So this is posing obviously a huge threat to African swine fever, but also foot and mouth disease and all sorts of other diseases could be coming in with this. So we know that there's sort of 80 tons that have been captured so far. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Dover Port Health Authority acknowledges that there's much more getting in. They do not have sufficient resource, and DEFRA has informed them that they will be cutting the budget to that programme as of this year. We're all still waiting for more detail on that. And in the meantime, as MPA, we are trying to lobby the government and lobbying DEFRA and the ministers to say, look, we need more resource, not less. This is a really huge, obviously a huge threat to our commercial pork industry in this country. And then just a couple of other things that we're also lobbying on in relation to this. We're also saying that as well as these sort of illegal meat imports obviously need tighter controls and more resources given to them, we also are asking for a total ban on non-commercial meat imports. So currently under the personal import policy that's in place, anyone can travel abroad anywhere and come back into the UK with up to 2 kilograms of meat that's kind of from anywhere, in fact from the EU, that's sort of a recognised EU labelled pork. However, we're saying that we should immediately be implementing a system whereby that meat is not actually legal anymore, and therefore it will be much easier for people travelling, people going on holidays, to understand that you cannot bring meat back into the UK because it does pose a disease risk to all the agricultural sectors, though of course the pig sector is particularly under pressure with African swine fever moving so rapidly across Europe into the West, as Mandy's just gone through. So we've been pushing these messages as much as possible. We're now, of course, in the pre-election period, and that makes it very difficult for us to continue those conversations with DEFRA and further conversations with APHA, FSA, everybody else who should be involved in this. That's now been stalled for another month or so, but hopefully we can resume those conversations as soon as the election is over. So can we move to the next slide, please? So this is now looking at contingency planning. So as Mandy said briefly there, you as farm business managers, whether a unit manager, if you own the business, whatever situation, your farm should be looking at what you can now do to both prevent African swine fever, and then what to do in the worst case scenario where either you end up with African swine fever on your farm, or if you are caught in one of those control zones that Mandy just went through then. So first of all, what you can do right now, as in get off this call and start thinking about this sort of thing for the next sort of few weeks. First thing is to make sure that your staff are aware of the signs of African swine fever. Mandy's just summarised them, and there's lots of information on the AHDB and MPA websites covering this sort of thing off. So make sure they know the signs of ASF and who to call if it is suspected. So all those important phone numbers need to be kept somewhere really visible, really accessible for the whole team on site. You know, and that's not just your vet and APHA, but it's also your feed merchants, your farm assurance, your processors, anybody involved in that farm business who will need to know if you have got a suspect or confirmed case of ASF on your farm. The next thing then, and an area that we've sort of seen a lot of deficiencies, if you like, we've seen this to be a problem with the poultry sector with avian influenza. We don't want the same thing to be an issue in our sector if, again, the worst happens. So it's about keeping your farm movements really clearly documented. So this isn't just the pig movements on and off that you're very used to doing. It's also people, machinery, feed, any fertilizers, slurries, vets, rodent control. We've been made aware that rodent control companies routinely come on and off farms and do not keep their own records of where they've been. So you need to be considering that sort of other element as well, so that you know who's been there. In the situation where if you ended up with ASF and you had to notify and it was a positive result, a positive result as in it was confirmed as ASF, you would need to present 21 days of movements at least. So do make sure you've got that available digitally, ideally, and also saved in a cloud where it can be accessed from different locations, because you never know where you'll be when these calls start happening. You know, you might be off farm and it might be your unit manager who calls you. It could be anything like this. So do try and have that organised, logical and digital, not just scribbled on the back of notebooks and bits of paper here, there and everywhere. And then we'll go into more detail on this on the next slide, but the contingency planning is really, really important. And AHDB and MPA, we're all really trying to bang the drum on this now and start you guys as producers thinking about what you need to do. So take some time, sit down with your team and put together a contingency plan for your business. So this doesn't have to just be ASF. It could be for any emergency, really, disease or not a disease, really. But it's looking at, for the cases of today's discussion, it's really looking at what you would do if you were stuck in a disease control zone. So you would, as Mandy has just shown you, if you're stuck in a control zone, you will need to have animals held on farm for at least 30 days. But we know it could be, 3 months or so, which is, it's a difficult one to approach, and it's not the easiest thing to think about. But that will all need looking at now, and that will make it a little bit less stressful if that does actually happen. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. The last thing then is biosecurity. So the message we really want to share about biosecurity is that this is the last line of defense, and it is the thing that will ultimately stop African swine fever from getting onto your farm. We can do what we want with lobbying the kind of border control. We can have discussions with APHA and DEFRA. We can make sure that the supply chain is as tight as possible so that we can cope with any scenarios. However, it will not stop it getting onto your farm if your biosecurity is lax. We knew that the poultry industry thought that their biosecurity was very strong, and then of course we've all seen the last few years how many cases of avian influenza they've ended up with. So please do take that very seriously. The other thing to say though, as well, on the flip side of that, is that ASF isn't as virulent as classical swine fever. It also doesn't plume like FMD. So please don't think that it's inevitable that if ASF is confirmed in Britain, that it will one day end up on your farm. We're aware of situations, farms in the EU, which are surrounded by wild boar that are, carrying ASF, where there have been other local farms which have gone down with ASF, and through good biosecurity, they have kept it off their farm. So please do use the resources available. AHDB in particular has a lot of biosecurity focused resource on their website. Speak to your vet, look at what vulnerabilities you might have, and please take that really seriously. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So the contingency planning then, this again, as I said, it might be a bit of an overwhelming discussion, but it's something that really needs to be considered. So as Mandy's kind of run through, if your farm is confirmed with ASF, APHA will come on, they will land with a team of people, and they will basically take over. They will need a lot of information. I believe that the form they bring onto site is about 40 pages long, and the first thing they would usually do is sit down with you and fill that out. If you have this kind of information available, it will make that a much, much quicker conversation and hopefully less distressing for yourself. So what they will need is kind of key farm information, so site plans, including maps, your access points, what pigs are where, that kind of thing. Having something like ordnance survey coordinates or Watford Words references for entry and exit points, shed entrances, gateways, that kind of thing. That all needs to be laid out really clearly. Then a bit more detail about your buildings. So again, what building is where, what age, what number of pig is in what buildings, what stage of production, and then, and of course, APHA are not going to understand names like top shed, big shed, old shed, new shed, which I know we all have those on farms, all different kinds of farms. We use those sorts of things, but you want it to be really clear and have a system where it's actually really sort of official and formal, if you like, so that you can hand over those details if needed. There's then also, that's kind of what would happen if you were confirmed with ASF, but in any case, you want this kind of stuff available. And then just to move on to the next few points then, if you're stuck in a disease control zone, that's really where the contingency plan comes into its own and where it's going to be really, really important. So I've just mentioned that, you could end up having to keep pigs on farm for a number of months potentially. So what are you going to do about housing them, feeding them, providing straw if you're in a straw system, muck and slurry storage and sort of disposal? All of these things will be restricted. It is not just pig movements that are restricted. It is all of these things. What can you do there? It's also worth bearing in mind that things like semen will actually have movement controls in it as well, so you might not be able to get that onto farm. There's going to be all kinds of elements here which are really complex and will basically mean that nothing can come on or off. So you need to be thinking about this now. Now, really sadly, you may have to consider welfare culling if you've had to hold the pigs for a long time. If the welfare is starting to become a problem, that is something that you may have to think about. So, do you have a contract with a locally licensed slaughter person who can come on and cull your animals out if that's needed? If you're not physically able to house them anymore, how can this be done? Do you have an area where you could do this? So, a large concrete area is ideal, somewhere that's out of sight of road, away from public rights of way, and where you've got space for sort of cull, disposal and transport. So do think of that. And then, of course, also the really difficult discussion with that is, the welfare. The welfare of you and your staff and your family and that sort of thing. So that's a really difficult one to approach, but do think about that as a potential issue that you may end up running to down the line and what your plans are for that. And then, so I've just talked about biosecurity, and biosecurity doesn't become unimportant once you have a case. If your next door neighbour is confirmed with ASF and you are in a control zone, again, like I said, it's not in any way inevitable that it will end up with you. So you'll be very tightened up with movement restrictions, but also make sure that your herd is still protected. So signposts at the entrances, on any public rights of way, because it's not very easy to close a public right of way, even in a disease situation, if it's going right through your farmyard. So just bear that in mind. So signs up saying that, you know, we are in a control zone, no one's allowed to come on or off, you know, and keep those biosecurity protocols really, really tight, and consider, as Mandy mentioned, sort of children going to school, carers, elderly people, your workers coming on and off, all that sort of thing. Just consider how that might look. And then finally, then, just to consider sort of the wider farm business. A lot of you will have something diversified. It may not be on that main pig site, which is more convenient, but if you do have a farm shop, if you've got commercial property, rental property, anything like that, that is going to be limited as well. So do think about the kind of impact on your actual income and on those businesses. And then finally, your neighbours. I mean, what do your neighbours have? Do they have other livestock? Do they have chutes, waterways, those sorts of things? Those are all going to be a factor. So if you just move on to the last and final slide, please. So these are really the take-home messages that we wanted to sort of impart for you today. So like I just talked about, the contingency plan, just do it. There's a lot to consider. It will be a little bit overwhelming perhaps to look at this first of all, but in the long run, it will be so much better to have this something in place, a plan in place that's sort of printed off, kept digitally as well, that's got all these details, that is kept live. You know, this is a live document. It's not just meant to be written, put in a cupboard and locked away and then no one can ever find it if it's needed. Have this ready and keep it updated, you know, routinely. In the end, it will ultimately be better for sort of you, your business, your family and your staff if you can get this done. And in whichever scenario you may end up in, and we hope it's none of these scenarios that we've talked about, it will be a lot easier. Then biosecurity, again, we've talked about it. There's nothing else really to be said. You may think it's good, but there will be critical points here and there that could be improved on. So really look at those key risks and sort of plan to mitigate if possible. And on both the contingency plan and biosecurity, do these in conjunction with your vet. They will want to be involved in this, and they should be involved in this. So then, as I sort of mentioned previously, there are a lot of existing resources to help with all of this. So please don't think that we're just saying go out, start with a blank piece of paper. We have a joint contingency plan. There's all sorts of bits of resource on the MPA website and on the AHDB website. And of course, you can always get in touch with either organisation to see if there's anything else. And we're also, of course, always working on new resources at the moment, updating old ones, creating new ones, and planning other ways of engaging to kind of help take you through that. But this is the start of a 10. And then just my very final point here is don't panic. Nothing's happened, nothing has changed. There's nothing that we know that you don't know. We just want to make sure that you as producers are as prepared as you can be. You know, the sector has changed a lot over the last 2 years, and there's a lack of experience with notifiable diseases, both in DEFRA, APHA, and also within industry as well. So the aim is to be as prepared as possible at all levels of the supply chain. And there will be things that we are working out as we go along. So the more prepared we are now, the better it will be if we end up in that scenario. So ultimately, guys, it's up to you trying to keep it off your farm and getting these contingency plans ready. So, you know, hopefully there's lots of questions waiting in the chat for us. And I'll just leave it there, Laura. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you just to yourself and Mandy for a very thought-provoking presentation this afternoon. Just a reminder to everyone, if you have any questions, they can be popped into the question box, which is in the top right-hand corner of your screen. We've got nothing in yet, so I'll probably kickstart with one, probably for yourself, Mandy, to kickstart. So if I have a farm, I've done nothing at the moment, where do I start? What's my first step?
I think the first step is to think about it logically. I would encourage farms to set aside some dedicated time. Depending on how big your farm is going to be variable. But think about who's on your farm currently, who's looking after the pigs. Would they have the skills to identify the disease should it come onto your farm? So that's the first thing you can do. I think continual attention to biosecurity. If you've ever got a spare minute of the day, we should be getting into the habit to think about biosecurity. How can we improve it? And then I think actually setting aside some time to do some contingency planning is really useful, and use the people that you've got on your farm, different eyes looking at the same situation can be really beneficial to look at it from a different viewpoint and just think about the things that you can control. I think it can become quite overwhelming. It's one of those things that's a really big issue and I think can be quite daunting. But if we take a stepwise approach to it and just tick small things off that we can control, soon you'll have quite a lot of, you'll have plans and processes in place that you can control. The first part of the contingency plan is quite often a checklist of essential phone numbers and things like that. And as Katie said, thinking about your farm in terms of what 3 words, that can be really key when you're trying to give instructions for people to come onto the farm or to know which shed that they need to go and look at. So doing that in a stepwise plan, I think would be beneficial, and small things really do make a difference.
Absolutely. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that, Katie?
I don't think anything significant to add, really. I mean, we've sort of run through the main points, and I just really to drive home that we know it's stressful, we know it's difficult. When you look at a draft contingency plan, which again we have available if anyone wants to get in touch and ask for a draft that you can use. Looking through, there's a lot to think about, but having any of those bases covered is going to be better than day one and you've got none of them covered. So please do take it seriously and not put it off.
And probably we've got no further questions yet in the box, so probably final question unless any more come in. But what role do you see both MPA and AHDB having in the preparation phase of any potential disease outbreak? And then I guess the same question for if and when we are in a notifiable disease situation. I don't know whether Mandy, you want to kickstart with that one.
Yeah, so I think for us at AHDB there are 2 things. Obviously, we will have our own AHDB contingency plan because business will not be the same for AHDB. It won't be the same for any business in the pork sector. But obviously we don't have pigs, so our contingency plan is not going to focus on restrictions on pigs, but it's going to involve more about what we do in terms of deploying teams within AHDB and how we support our levy payers. And I can see that a lot of people from AHDB will be deployed into supporting the pig industry. So it will be around upskilling that. But in terms of helping levy payers and supporting levy payers, I think because every farm is unique, we can't come up with a template that's going to work on every farm. It is up to individual farms to do their own contingency plan. They'll all have unique situations. We can help guide them. We can help support wherever we can. As Katie said, we've got a template of a contingency plan and trying to work with the sectors. We've also got a lot of resources and messaging in different languages. We've got signage that you can download. We've got clinical signs, images on our website, and we've got signposts to DEFRA websites. In case ASF does come in, I think what we would be doing would be working very closely with Katie and Lizzie and MPA. We would have a dedicated phone line that producers could phone. That can be quite useful. I put up the zones, the temporary control zones, and sometimes it's not very easy to see whether your farm is actually in a surveillance zone or a protection zone. And actually our bureau team are trained to look at that on an ordnance survey map, and they can tell you which zone you're in if you're in a zone. We would also be doing regular updates to our levy payers and trying to get them as up to date as possible as the disease progresses.
Thanks, Mandy. Would you like to come in, Katie, from an MPA's point of view?
Yeah, so sort of first of all, the sort of pre-disease scenario, if you like, sort of what we're doing now, what we've been doing for a few months. There will be an updated version of the government's control measures. That's the legislation which controls what happens in the case of ASF. We are waiting for those amendments to be published. It has, of course, now been delayed by the pre-election period and the election, What we know is that it is designed to bring us more in line with what the EU has in place. So that's hopefully a positive step and will make it a bit easier to understand. That's all I can say about that at the moment. It's all we know. There's not much more to add to it, but that will be coming out. So while that's happening, we have been working quite closely with DEFRA and APHA, sort of trying to understand what they know, what they don't know, what we need to know, and filling in all those gaps around it. A lot of that has been, I mean, I mentioned there at the end of my presentation that there's not a huge amount of institutional knowledge about dealing with notifiable diseases. So what we're doing is actually trying to educate those sort of animal disease teams at DEFRA and APHA about the pig industry, because that knowledge isn't necessarily there anyway anymore, and it's not as good as it was once upon a time. So we've been trying to work on that a little bit and get that knowledge up, which is giving them a bit more of an appreciation of the impact it could have on the supply chain, because we are, of course, such an integrated sector, and we know that these pigs move up and down the country all the time, every day of the week. So there's a lot there for them to understand. And then when it comes to the actual to disease outbreak, we would be continuing to work very closely, of course, with AHDB. But, for us, it would be about supporting members, making sure that the information to them is as clear and available and updated as possible. As Mandy said, knowing about the control zones where the latest cases are, that can be, I know that can actually be quite stressful for producers, even if you're not in one of those zones. APHA will likely set up a sort of alert system that you can sign up to, and you will be getting texts coming through. And we know from poultry farmers during the AI crisis of the last few years, that could be quite stressful, getting texts at 8 o'clock at night saying that there was a situation. So what we would aim to do is to have something in place that means you don't need to be attached to your phone in that way. You perhaps can not worry too much that we will be the ones kind of leading on that contact. It's all still very much to be seen. It will depend how it unravels, how many cases there are, where they are, how many producers are affected. But the key thing, if the disease does land, will be supporting members and supporting farmers, and trying to get as much clarity as possible for how things can progress, and hopefully ensuring that it doesn't spread any further. So yeah.
Thank you, Katie. We don't have any further questions in the chat, so I just want to thank everyone for joining us for today's webinar. If there are any further questions that crop up once we leave you this afternoon, then please do get in touch with either AHDB or NPA. I think our contact details will be circulated to everybody that's joined the webinar today, so do please feel free to get in contact with any of us. And we look forward to welcoming you to any of our future webinars and events. So everybody take care and have a good evening.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you, bye.